Hey everyone, and welcome to our first Mammoth Interactive tutorial on UI elements in Xcode using Swift 3. As this is the first tutorial on UI elements, we're going to actually do something different, so we're not working in the playground anymore, we're working in applications. So what I did is I just created a new project, and that brought me to this page here. So as you can see, we're in Xcode. It's just starting a new project for us, so it's going to be a little different from the playground that we've experienced. Now, whereas the playground is just the one file that constantly compiles and runs, and is very good for kind of testing your code and learning how to use the Swift language, it's not really good for any kind of an app development. And that's why we have this project option. So we use the projects to develop the apps, and the playground's more just to kind of get used to the language and to try new things out. Okay, so anytime we're creating an app or introducing these new UI elements, we're usually going to be working in this project space rather than in just the playground. Okay, so I'm just in Xcode, and I again just created a new project. This is the first window that comes up. So the UI element that we're focusing on today is going to be a label. Now this is probably the most basic UI element, and we're going to be using labels in pretty much all of our apps. So a label is simply a way to display some kind of a text and this is a way to display the text in such a way that the user cannot modify it. So as you can see, this is it's just the simulator here, and all we have is one label that says this is some label text. Okay, so this isn't what our final label is going to look like, but this is just an example of a label. Alright, so as you can see, you can't really see, but I am clicking on it and trying to move it around and nothing is happening. That's again just because a label is just a way to display text. Okay, so it's not an interactive element, it's just there to display. Okay, so I'm just going to minimize this. Again, this isn't what our final product will look like, but that's okay. So we'll minimize it, and let's get started with a single view application. So this is under iOS applications. We'll click next. Let's give this a name. So let's just call this labels tutorial, and we'll give it an organization name and identifier. The language that we're using is going to be Swift rather than Objective-C. The devices will be universal rather than restricting ourselves to an iPhone or iPad. We'll not use core data. That's a little advanced, and we'll get more into that in the later applications. We will include unit tests and UI tests, although we won't actually end up really using them. So let's click next, and we'll choose a place to save this. I'm just going to save it to the desktop for now, but save it wherever is appropriate for you. Okay, so after we click create there, it just creates our project for us. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a very brief rundown of the layout, and then I'll let you guys familiarize yourself, because I think it's the best way to learn the layout is to kind of explore around yourself. So on the left we have a project navigator. So this is all the files in our project. This is just kind of a file system. On the right we have a couple of toolbars. The bottom right is for adding our UI elements, and the top right is for modifying the attributes of the elements. So this can include stuff like size, color, alignment, and stuff like that. Okay, so we just have an empty file, well, this is a default file open right now, just contains some kind of properties of the project. The two files that we generally work with are viewcontroller.swift and main.storyboard. So main.storyboard is a file we use to design our layout. So this is where we can actually add elements to a blank canvas and design how the app will look. The viewcontroller.swift file is where we'll actually put the actual source code, and this will be just kind of a bunch of text really. So I'll open them both up just by clicking on them once, and there you go, see it opens up the file. So this is the main.storyboard file. We will just close the side panel here and switch. We click on here, we can choose choose from a few different devices. I usually develop in the iPhone SE just because it's a nice enough size that it fills up the screen without without being too big. So this is a phone simulator, And again, this is kind of like the blank canvas that we'll use to drag and drop elements in. So as you can see, our elements are all on the right here. We have lots of stuff. We have labels, buttons, texts, switches, and a whole bunch of stuff to play with. So we add elements just by dragging them and dropping them. And as you can see, the background's turned kind of this light blue, and we get this green plus prompt here. So if we just let it go, then it adds the element right on there. It's going to delete it. But that's basically how you add elements to the layout. Okay, so again, this is just where we design how the app is going to look and which elements we want to include. If we switch over to the viewcontroller.swift file, it will just close the previous file and open up the next one. And this is where we're going to put all of our source code. So as you can see, there's a little bit here to begin with. This just deals with, well, as you can see, this is just kind of deals with the setup and a view did load. So as its name might imply, this is going to be anything that we want to load or display as soon as the app loads. This is, we're going to put in this function here. This did receive memory warning. Really don't worry about this. I never touch it, but it's just to basically dispose of any resources that can be recreated. Okay, so these are the two main files that we'll be working with, viewcontroller.swift and main.storyboard. If you want to open them in different windows, we can do that. Just double click and opens in a new window there. If we want to open the two side by side, we can call on what we call the assistant editor. So if we click on this, it opens two files side by side, and then we can choose, maybe we want main.storyboard up here. So I just dragged it and dropped it in. And so then we get the main.storyboard on the left and the view controller on the right. So these toolbars can be a little annoying sometimes. So what we're going to do is, if we want to get rid of them, we just click the appropriate button so we can hide that or make it reappear there. Same with the toolbar on the right and the one on the bottom. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to switch back to our standard editor, and we generally start in the main.storyboard file. So usually we start by adding items to our layout, then we start, and then we the middle part is the implementation, and then the final part is the design aspect where we make the app or whatever it is look really nice. In this part, we're just doing a kind of an intro into UI elements, so we won't really focus too much on the actual app development side. We just want to get you used to the elements and used to knowing how they work. So our focus at this time will be a label. Again, this is just going to be a way to display text. The user cannot interact with this element, but we can modify it from within the code and from within the properties toolbar on the right here. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump right in. We'll start by just adding a label and talking a little bit more about exactly what it is and how to use it. Okay, so now we have the basic setup down. We're just going to set a label in the user interface. So we're going to select a label from this list of objects, which is seen in the bottom right of our IDE. We're going to add it to the emulator. And the way we do this is we're just going to select it and drag and drop it. And then we're also going to talk about how to modify the attributes in the attribute editor. So there are two ways to modify the attributes. One is in the code itself, and one is in the attribute editor. The difference is that once it's in the attribute editor, we can't change it once the app is running, whereas in the code we can kind of write conditions to change stuff like text or different attributes while the code and the actual app is running. So we'll see only how to modify the attributes in the attribute editor. The next part will be focusing on editing stuff in the code. Okay, so now we have our basic setup down. We have the emulator on the left hand side here. So this is the iPhone 4S that we selected. We have the source code, which is the viewcontroller.swift on the right hand side here. And we have our properties on the far right and our file explorer on the far left. Now we don't need the file explorer open right now, and I'd like the extra room, so I'm just going to go ahead and close that up. But we can open it again as needed. Okay. So let's take a look at how to add in a label to our design. So what we're going to do is, under this window here, we're going to, if we haven't already selected the the circle with a square in it, which is going to be called show the object library. This which contains a library of objects that we can add into the UI interface, or the user interface. So we're going to go ahead and select a label, and we'll just click on it and drag it in, and it's not letting us do that yet, but there we go. So now that it's highlighted, you see it's kind of turned a light blue, and there's this green plus button. We can simply let go and drag and drop it in. Okay, so now we see these boxes around where we can adjust the size. So we can do this in one of two ways. We can do it manually like this, and I don't want it to go off the phone screen there. It's going to make it a little bigger. So we can do it this way, or if we go up here to the top right, if we select the ruler, then we can directly increase or decrease the size. So X and Y will be how far from the left and how far from the top it is, and then the width and height will be, well, the width and the height respectively. So if we want to fine-tune this, we could have this be, let's say, 20, and you see it's increased in size, or it's moved over to the left there. And let's have the width be something like 250. In fact, let's make it even bigger, 260. Okay, and then the Y, let's just have it 50, and the height we can also set to be 50. Okay, so again, you can either adjust the size using these little boxes here, or you can go right into the ruler, which would be the size inspector, and fine-tune it this way. Okay, and you can increase the size individually, unit by unit, or you can just go ahead and change the number directly here. Okay, so that's how to change the size of a label. And it's important to know the boundaries of your screen here. So let's just see, let's just see what 270 looks like. And how about 280? So it seems like 280 plus the 20 seems to put us right in the middle. So it seems this phone screen is about 320 units wide. Because if we were to go 0 and 320, then it brings us right to the edges. Okay, so that's a good trick to know, it's a good thing to know to be able to tell how wide or how big your phone screen is, because then you can fine-tune these to kind of set them up in a uniform fashion. Okay, so that's how to access the size, change the size. If we want to change properties, there are two ways we can do this. We can first initialize it in the code and change it directly by calling a series of functions on the label, or we can go to this button here, the attributes inspector, and change a lot of the properties right in here. So if we look, we can change stuff like the text style, so it can be plain or attributed. We can change the text itself in this field. Right now it contains a text label. Let's have it say something like hello. Then as you can see, it changes here. There's a tag, so this is the number of lines that we can let our label have. Now this is something to note, because labels in iOS will basically only occupy as many lines as we allow them to. So if we only allow this to occupy one line, regardless of how much text is in this label, it will only ever be able to go on one line. Okay, so keep that in mind if you have labels with very large text or labels with a lot of text. You might want to change this tag number to accommodate and allow there to be multiple lines. Okay, then there are properties such as user interaction and multiple touch enabled. So if user interaction is not enabled, then the label is just a label and it cannot change at all. Okay, so then we have other stuff like alpha, background, tint. These are going to be colors. Then we have these drawing settings and stretching, and that is just about it for the properties field under here. If we go to the next panel up here, then we can see stuff like the class. We know this is a UI view from this here. We can change a class if we want, but it's best just to leave it as is. If we click on the question mark, there's usually, there we go, documentation's popped up, so this will tell you a little bit more about it if you're really interested in reading it. Personally, I think a lot of the documentation is very wordy and almost a little confusing, so, you know, take what it says with a grain of salt. Okay, so that's pretty much all there is to setting up the label. We'll now look at how to add the label into the code itself and then modify it directly in there. So this part just involves setting up a label in the user interface. So we simply selected a label from our list of objects and we dragged and dropped it into the phone emulator layout. Okay, so this effectively adds a label into the phone emulator so that if the emulator was run, it would have some kind of a label displaying a text. Okay, so labels are basically just a way to display some kind of a text, and we're doing an entire tutorial on these things because they're going to be used a lot in pretty much all of your phone applications. Okay, so we only modified a few of the attributes of this particular label that we added, and we did this using the attributes editor. Okay, so this part coming up, we'll be looking at how to modify the attributes from the code itself.